The small diner on the corner of Main Street was always buzzing with activity. It wasn't anything fancy, just a cozy place where locals came to grab a quick bite or sip coffee while chatting about their day. The walls were painted a warm yellow, and the smell of pancakes and bacon lingered in the air. For most people passing by, it was just another ordinary spot. But for the waitress working there, it was more than that. It was her second home. She had been working at the diner for years, balancing plates stacked high with food, pouring endless cups of coffee, and dealing with customers who ranged from friendly regulars to grumpy strangers. Her name isn't important here. What mattered was how she carried herself. She was the kind of person who noticed things others overlooked. A tired mother struggling to calm her crying child, an elderly man sitting alone in the corner, or someone hesitating at the door, unsure if they belonged inside. On this particular afternoon, the diner was packed. People were laughing, talking loudly, and clinking forks against plates. Amidst all the noise, she caught sight of someone different. A man sat quietly in one of the booths near the window. His clothes were old but clean, patched up in places as though he'd taken care to mend them himself. His face told a story of hard times with lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth. He looked out of place among the crowd, almost invisible, like he didn't want to be noticed. He ordered only a cup of coffee, which surprised no one. Folks like him often came in, not because they wanted to eat, but because they needed somewhere warm to sit for a while. Most of the staff ignored him, too busy rushing around to pay much attention. But she couldn't help glancing his way every now and then. There was something about him that tugged at her heart. Maybe it was the way he held his cup so carefully, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Or maybe it was the way he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone who passed by. Then everything changed. Two men walked into the diner, loud and boisterous. They wore work boots caked with mud and dusty jeans, clearly construction workers taking a break from their job. At first, they blended into the chaos of the room, joining the line at the counter and joking around with each other. But when they spotted the man in the booth, their tone shifted. One of them pointed at him and laughed, making some crude comment about his appearance. The other joined in, raising his voice enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, buddy," one of them called, out smirking. "You even got money to pay for that coffee? Or are you planning to skip out before the bill comes?" The room went silent for a moment, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The man in the booth didn't respond. He simply stared at his cup, his hands gripping it tighter. Some patrons exchanged uncomfortable glances while others pretended not to notice. No one said a word, but she couldn't stay quiet. She set down the tray she was holding and walked over, planting herself firmly between the man in the booth and the two troublemakers. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to look calm. She'd seen plenty of rude behavior in her time at the diner, but this felt different. This wasn't just teasing, it was cruelty disguised as humor. "If you've got a problem," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface, "you can take it up with me." The two men stopped laughing and turned to face her. Their expressions hardened, and for a split second she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Standing up to bullies wasn't exactly part of her job description, but she refused to back down. "What's it to you?" one of them snapped, crossing his arms. "It's just a joke." "It doesn't sound like a joke to me," she shot back. "And if you're looking for entertainment, maybe try watching TV instead of picking on someone who hasn't done anything wrong." Her words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. The rest of the diner seemed frozen, waiting to see what would happen next. After a long pause, the two men muttered something under their breath and stormed out, slamming the door behind them. The room erupted into murmurs, but she barely heard them. All she could think about was the man still sitting in the booth. When she finally turned to check on him, he was already standing up, ready to leave. He gave her a brief nod, his lips moving as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. Then, without another sound, he slipped out of the diner, disappearing into the crowd outside. As the rush of adrenaline faded, she realized her hands were trembling. She hadn't planned to step in. It had just happened. And, though she didn't know it yet, that simple act of kindness would change far more than just one afternoon at the diner. The diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm after the confrontation. Plates clattered, conversations resumed, and the hum of everyday life filled the space again. But for the waitress, things felt different. Her pulse was still racing, and her mind replayed the scene over and over. She couldn't shake the image of the man in the booth. His quiet dignity, the way he'd tried so hard to fade into the background, and how his hands had gripped that coffee cup like it was a lifeline. As she went back to work, clearing tables and refilling drinks, snippets of what had just happened kept creeping into her thoughts. The two men's cruel words echoed in her head, sharp and biting. She hated how they'd treated him, not just because it was mean-spirited, but because it felt so unnecessary. What had he ever done to deserve that? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And yet, they'd singled him out, mocking him as if his worth could be measured by the state of his clothes or the amount of money in his pocket. She wasn't naive. She knew the world could be harsh. People judged others based on appearances all the time. It happened every day, everywhere. But seeing it, up close, especially in a place that was supposed to feel safe and welcoming, left a bitter taste in her mouth. It made her wonder, when did we stop treating each other like human beings? When did we start believing it was okay to tear someone down just because they weren't like us? Still, there was something else nagging at her. A tiny flicker of pride, mixed with uncertainty. Standing up to those men hadn't been easy. In fact, it had taken every ounce of courage she had. For a moment, she'd worried they might retaliate, maybe even cause a scene. But she'd done it anyway. Why? Because, deep down, she believed it was the right thing to do, even if no one else stepped forward, even if it meant putting herself in an uncomfortable position. She couldn't let them treat another person like garbage. But now, as the initial adrenaline wore off, doubt began to creep in. Had she overstepped? Some of the customers had looked impressed, nodding approvingly as she confronted the bullies. Others, however, seemed uneasy, glancing away or whispering behind their hands. Would her boss hear about this later? Would those men come back angrier and louder, looking for revenge? She didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed at her. Her shift dragged on, each minute feeling heavier than the last. By the time the lunch rush ended and the diner emptied out, exhaustion hit her like a wave. She leaned against the counter, letting out a long sigh. The cook poked his head out from the kitchen, raising an eyebrow. "You all right?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. "That was some pretty bold stuff back there." She shrugged, forcing a small smile. "I don't know. I guess I just couldn't stay quiet." He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Well, whatever you did, it took guts. Not everyone would have stood up like that." His words brought a faint warmth to her chest, but they didn't erase the lingering questions in her mind. What had become of the man in the booth? Where had he gone after leaving so abruptly? Had her intervention helped him, or had it only made things worse? She wished she could have said more to him, offered some kind of reassurance, maybe even asked his name, but he'd slipped away before she got the chance. As the afternoon wore on, the diner grew quieter, giving her too much time to think. She replayed the encounter again and again, imagining alternate scenarios. What if she hadn't spoken up? Would anyone else have intervened? Probably not. Most people avoided conflict whenever possible. It was easier to look the other way than to risk getting involved. But avoiding conflict didn't make the problem disappear. If anything, it let it fester, growing bigger and uglier until it consumed everything. By the time her shift ended, the sun was setting, casting golden light through the diner's windows. She grabbed her coat and stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air. The streets were quieter now, the hustle and bustle of daytime replaced by the soft hum of distant traffic. As she walked toward the bus stop, her thoughts drifted back to the man. Who was he really? Was he homeless? Did he have family somewhere? Or was he completely alone? She realized how little she actually knew about him, and how much she wanted to understand. When she finally got home, she collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. Her roommate glanced up from her book, arching an eyebrow. "You look wiped," she observed. Rough day? The waitress hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, kind of. Something happened at work. She recounted the story, leaving out no detail: the man in the booth, the rude construction workers, her decision to step in. Her roommate listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to admiration. Wow, she said when the story ended. That's wild. I can't believe you did that. Why? The waitress asked, sitting up straighter. Wouldn't you have done the same? Her roommate hesitated, chewing her lip. Honestly, I'm not sure. I'd like to think I would, but standing up to people like that isn't easy. It's kind of scary. The waitress sighed, running a hand through her hair. It was scary, but I couldn't just sit there and do nothing. He didn't deserve that. Nobody does. Her roommate smiled softly. You're braver than you give yourself credit for. The compliment lingered in her mind as she got ready for bed. Brave. Was she really? Or had she simply reacted without thinking, driven by instinct rather than courage? Either way, she couldn't deny the impact of what had happened. That man's face stayed with her, haunting her dreams like a ghost. She saw him everywhere, in the faces of strangers on the street, in the reflection of shop windows, even in the darkness behind her eyelids as she tried to sleep. And yet, despite the weight of the day, there was a strange sense of clarity. She'd always thought of herself as ordinary, just another person trying to get by in a complicated world. But today, she'd done something extraordinary. She'd stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for himself, refusing to let cruelty win. Maybe it hadn't changed the world, but it had changed her. And maybe, just maybe, it had planted a seed of hope in someone else's life. Little did she know, that seed was about to grow in ways she could never have imagined. 3 hours had passed since the incident at the diner, and the place was winding down. The last few customers trickled out, leaving behind crumbs on the tables and the faint smell of coffee in the air. The waitress finished wiping down the counters, her thoughts still tangled in what had happened earlier. She'd replayed the scene so many times in her head that it felt like a movie stuck on repeat. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the man in the booth. The way he'd gripped his coffee cup, the quiet dignity in his silence, and the way he'd slipped out without saying a word. Just as she was about to start stacking chairs, the door swung open. A bell above it jingled softly, signaling new arrivals. She glanced up, expecting to see a late-night straggler or maybe someone looking for directions. Instead, 3 men walked in, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. They were dressed sharply in suits, their ties neatly knotted and their jackets pressed to perfection. They looked completely out of place in the humble diner, like executives who'd accidentally wandered into the wrong part of town. The waitress straightened up, unsure of what to make of them. One of the men stepped forward, his expression calm, but serious. He scanned the room briefly before his gaze landed on her. "Excuse me," he said, his voice smooth and measured. "Are you the waitress who stood up for the man earlier today?" Her stomach dropped. How did they know about that? She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, that was me." "Why?" The man introduced himself, explaining that he worked for a local non-profit organization that helped people facing tough situations, homelessness, poverty, addiction, and more. His name wasn't important. What mattered was the story he told next. "The man you defended today, we've been trying to reach him for months. His name is Charlie. He's a veteran, a decorated one actually, but life hasn't been kind to him. He lost his family years ago, and ever since he's been struggling to find his footing." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. A veteran? This whole time, she'd thought of him as just another person down on his luck, someone who needed a little kindness. But hearing this changed everything. Suddenly, the weight of his quiet suffering made sense. It wasn't just bad luck or circumstance. It was layers upon layers of pain, loss, and hardship. And yet, despite all of that, he'd carried himself with a quiet grace, refusing to draw attention to himself even when others mocked him. The man continued, "We've been trying to get him to accept help, but he's resistant. He doesn't trust easily, And honestly, who can blame him? People haven't been kind to him. But today something shifted. When you stood up for him, you gave him hope. You showed him that not everyone has turned their back on him. She stared at the man, her mind racing. Hope? Was that really what she'd done? All she'd done was speak up, say a few words to defend someone who couldn't defend himself. She hadn't thought about it as giving anyone hope. To her, it had just been the right thing to do. But now, hearing this stranger explain the impact of her actions, she felt a lump form in her throat. What happens now? She asked quietly. I mean, will he be okay? The man sighed, running a hand over his tie. That's the tricky part. We want to help him, but he has to let us in. Trust takes time, especially for someone like Charlie. But your intervention today might have opened a door we couldn't before. That's why we're here. To thank you and see if you'd be willing to help us further. Help you how? She asked, frowning slightly. He explained that the organization often relied on people like her, ordinary individuals who connected with those in need in extraordinary ways. You have a gift, he said. You see people for who they are, not for their circumstances. That's rare, and it's exactly what someone like Charlie needs right now. Would you consider working with us? Even if it's just a few hours a week, your involvement could make a huge difference. The offer caught her off guard. Her, working with a non-profit? She'd never imagined herself doing anything like that. Sure, she cared about people, that much was obvious, but she wasn't sure she had the skills or experience to contribute meaningfully. Still, the idea tugged at her heart. If there was even a small chance she could help someone like Charlie, wasn't it worth exploring? I'll think about it, she said finally, her voice soft but firm. But I need some time to process all of this. The man nodded, understanding. Of course, take your time. Just know that what you did today didn't go unnoticed. Not by us, and certainly not by Charlie. After they left, the diner felt eerily quiet. She locked the door behind them, turning off the lights and stepping out into the cool night air. The streets were empty now, the hum of daytime activity replaced by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. As she walked home, her mind buzzed with questions. What would it mean to work with an organization like that? Could she really make a difference? And most importantly, would Charlie be all right? When she got home, she sat by the window, staring out at the darkened street. The image of Charlie lingered in her mind, clearer than ever. She thought about the sacrifices he must have made as a soldier, the losses he'd endured, and the battles he continued to fight every single day. And she thought about the role she'd played, however small, in reminding him that he wasn't alone. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of purpose ignite within her. Maybe this was more than just a random act of kindness. Maybe it was the beginning of something bigger, something that could change not only Charlie's life but hers as well. Little did she know, the journey was just getting started. The next morning, the waitress woke up with a sense of restlessness she couldn't quite shake. The conversation from the night before lingered in her mind like an unfinished song, replaying over and over again. She thought about the man in the booth, Charlie, and the 3 men in suits who had walked into the diner. Their words echoed in her head. You have a gift. You see people for who they are. Was that really true? Or were they just being kind? She decided to visit the nonprofit's office later that day, even if it was just to learn more. After, all curiosity wouldn't let her sit still. What did these organizations actually do? How could they help someone like Charlie? And why had they chosen her, of all people, to reach out to? These questions swirled around her brain as she got ready for work. When she arrived at the diner, the usual chaos greeted her. Orders flying in, customers chatting loudly, and the clatter of dishes filling the air. But today, everything felt different. The faces of the patrons seemed sharper somehow, as though she was seeing them for the first time. There was the elderly woman sitting alone by the window, sipping tea and staring absently outside. A young couple argued under their breath while sharing a plate of pancakes. Even the guy tapping impatiently on his phone at the counter looked less like background noise and more like a person with a story to tell. It dawned on her then, She'd always noticed people, hadn't she? Not because she tried to, but because it came naturally. Maybe that's what the man in the suit had meant when he called it a gift. She saw beyond the surface, the tired eyes, the nervous fidgeting, the forced smiles hiding something deeper. It wasn't extraordinary or magical, it was simply human, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough. After her shift ended, she made her way to the nonprofit's office. It was tucked away in a modest building downtown, easy to miss unless you were looking for it. Inside, the space was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and walls lined with photos of volunteers working alongside people from all walks of life. A bulletin board displayed handwritten notes of gratitude, each one telling a story of hope and resilience. The same man from the diner greeted her warmly, offering her a seat. He introduced her to a small team of dedicated individuals who worked tirelessly to support those in need. One by one, they shared stories of the people they'd helped, families torn apart by addiction, veterans struggling to adjust to civilian life, single parents juggling multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. Each story was heartbreaking, yet inspiring, a reminder of both the struggles people faced and the strength they found within themselves to overcome them. Then came the moment she'd been dreading. They asked her to join them. Not full-time, not immediately, but as a volunteer outreach worker. They explained that their biggest challenge wasn't finding resources, it was building trust. Many of the people they wanted to help had been let down by society so many times that they didn't believe anyone truly cared anymore. That's where she came in. Her ability to connect with people, to listen without judgment and offer genuine compassion, could be the bridge they needed. At first, she hesitated. This wasn't part of her plan. She'd always seen herself as just a waitress, someone who served coffee and cleaned tables. Could she really step into this new role? What if she failed? What if she said the wrong thing or made things worse instead of better? But as she listened to the team talk about their mission, something inside her shifted. They weren't asking her to fix everything. They were asking her to show up, to care, to remind people that they mattered. And deep down, she realized that was exactly what she'd been doing all along. Whether it was comforting a stressed-out customer at the diner or standing up for Charlie when no one else would, she'd always believed in the power of small acts of kindness. Maybe this was just the next step. "I'll try," she said finally, surprising even herself. "But I can't promise I'll be good at it." The team smiled, clearly pleased with her response. "That's all we ask," the man replied. "Just show up. The rest will follow." Over the next few weeks, she threw herself into learning everything she could about the organization's work. She attended training sessions, shadowed experienced outreach workers, and spent hours listening to stories of triumph and heartbreak. Slowly but surely, she began to understand the scope of the problem and the potential for change. Her first assignment came sooner than expected. The team asked her to accompany them to a local shelter where Charlie had occasionally stayed. They hoped to find him there and convince him to accept their help. As they approached the shelter, her nerves kicked in. What if he didn't want to see her? What if he resented her for interfering? She pushed the thoughts aside, reminding herself that this wasn't about her. It was about giving him a chance to rebuild his life. Inside the shelter, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale bread. Rows of cots lined the room, some occupied by weary-looking individuals wrapped in blankets. At first glance, she didn't spot Charlie. Then, near the back corner, she saw him. He was sitting on a cot, hunched over with a book in his hands. His posture was guarded, as though he expected trouble at any moment. Her heart sank. He looked smaller somehow, more worn down than she remembered. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, the team following close behind. "Hey," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you remember me?" Charlie froze, his fingers tightening around the edges of the book. For a long moment, he didn't move or speak. Then, slowly, he raised his head and looked at her. Recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by something else. Caution, maybe, or curiosity. "I'm sorry if I caused you any trouble the other day," she continued, choosing her words carefully. I didn't think it was fair. What those guys were saying to you. No one deserves that. He studied her face, searching for something, sincerity perhaps, or a hint of ulterior motive. Finally, he nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly. Thank you, he murmured, his voice rough and quiet, for standing up for me. The simple acknowledgement sent a wave of relief through her. She introduced him to the team, explaining who they were and why they were there. At first he was hesitant, brushing off their offers of assistance with polite dismissals. But as the conversation went on, she noticed a subtle shift. He started asking questions about housing programs, counseling, services, job training opportunities. By the end of the meeting, he agreed to take the first step, visiting the nonprofit's office to discuss his options further. As they left the shelter, the team congratulated her on breaking through to him. You did great, one of them said, patting her shoulder. That was huge. She smiled, though her chest felt tight with emotion. Huge? She wasn't sure about that. All she'd done was listen, offer support, and remind him that he wasn't invisible. Still, if that was enough to give him a glimmer of hope, then maybe she was exactly where she was meant to be. Walking home that evening, she felt lighter somehow, as though a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying had lifted. Helping someone like Charlie wasn't going to be easy. It would require patience, persistence, and plenty of humility. But for the first time in years, she felt like she was making a difference, and that, she decided, was worth every ounce of effort. Over the next few weeks, the waitress threw herself into her new role with a determination that surprised even herself. She hadn't expected to feel so connected to the work, or to the people she was helping. At first, it was overwhelming. Every day brought new challenges, navigating complex systems of aid, dealing with skepticism from those who had been let down too many times, and learning how to balance compassion with boundaries. But slowly, she began to find her rhythm. One of her earliest tasks was working closely with Charlie. After their initial meeting at the shelter, he'd agreed to visit the nonprofit's office for a follow-up conversation. That first visit was tense but hopeful. He sat stiffly in the chair, his hands clasped tightly together, as the team explained the resources available to him. Housing assistance, mental health counseling, job training programs. It all sounded promising on paper, but Charlie remained cautious. He didn't trust easily, and who could blame him? Life had taught him that promises were often empty, and help usually came with strings attached. But she stayed patient. Instead of pushing him to make decisions right away, she focused on building rapport. During their meetings, she listened more than she spoke, letting him share bits and pieces of his story at his own pace. She learned about his time in the military, the sacrifices he'd made, the camaraderie he'd cherished, and the trauma he'd carried home with him long after his service ended. She heard about the tragedy that had shattered his family, leaving him adrift in a world that felt cold and indifferent. Each revelation broke her heart a little more, but it also deepened her resolve. This wasn't just about providing resources, it was about restoring dignity. It was about showing Charlie and others like him that they mattered, that their struggles weren't invisible, and that there were still people willing to fight for them. As weeks turned into months, progress came in small, incremental steps. With support from the nonprofit, Charlie secured temporary housing at a transitional facility designed to help veterans reintegrate into civilian life. For the first time in years, he had a roof over his head, regular meals, and access to counseling services tailored to his needs. The change wasn't immediate. There were setbacks, moments of frustration, and days when he questioned whether it was worth the effort. But he kept moving forward, one step at a time. She celebrated every milestone, no matter how minor it seemed. When Charlie attended his first group therapy session, she cheered silently inside. When he landed a part-time job at a local warehouse, she beamed with pride. And when he finally moved into a modest apartment of his own, she couldn't hold back the tears. Standing in the doorway of his new home, watching him unpack boxes and arrange furniture, she realized how far he'd come, not just physically, but emotionally. "You did this," he said quietly one evening as they sat together in his living room. If you hadn't stood up for me that day, I don't know where I'd be." She shook her head, brushing off the compliment. "No, Charlie. You did this. All I did was remind you that you weren't alone. The rest was all you." He smiled faintly, though his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Maybe, but sometimes that's all someone needs, a reminder." Her work with Charlie inspired her to expand her efforts. As she grew more confident in her role, she started accompanying the outreach team to other shelters, soup kitchens, and street corners. Everywhere they went, she met people whose lives had been derailed by circumstances beyond their control. Some were eager to accept help. Others were wary, needing time to build trust. Regardless of their reactions, she approached each interaction with the same warmth and sincerity that had resonated with Charlie. There was the single mother juggling 3 jobs while raising 2 young children, desperate for affordable childcare so she could pursue better opportunities. There was the elderly man living out of his car, too proud to ask for assistance until his health began to fail. And there was the teenager running away from an abusive home, searching for safety and stability in a world that felt overwhelmingly hostile. Each person carried their own burdens, their own stories of loss and resilience. Yet beneath the surface they shared something universal: the desire to be seen, to be valued, and to have a chance at a brighter future. Through it all, she discovered something unexpected. Helping others wasn't just changing their lives. It was transforming hers too. Before, her days at the diner had felt routine, predictable, almost monotonous. Now, every moment brimmed with purpose. Whether she was handing out blankets to someone sleeping rough or sitting across from a veteran, discussing treatment options, she felt alive in a way she never had before. Her old self, the version of her who worried endlessly about bills and deadlines, seemed distant now, like a character from someone else's story. Her growing involvement with the nonprofit didn't go unnoticed. Word spread quickly among the staff and volunteers about the Waitress-turned-outreach worker who had a knack for connecting with people. Local businesses began reaching out, eager to partner with the organization. A nearby grocery store donated food supplies weekly. A clothing retailer offered free uniforms for job training participants. Even the construction workers who had harassed Charlie showed up one day, sheepishly apologizing and asking how they could contribute. "They came here?" she asked incredulously when the team told her. "Why?" "They said they felt bad about what happened," one of the volunteers explained. "I think seeing you stand up for Charlie made them realize they needed to do better." The irony wasn't lost on her. Those same men who had mocked Charlie were now volunteering their time and skills to help renovate the nonprofit's community center. Change, she realized, wasn't always immediate, but it was possible. Sometimes all it took was one act of courage to spark a chain reaction. By the end of the year, the nonprofit's impact had grown exponentially. More people were receiving the support they needed, and the community rallied around the cause in ways no one had anticipated. Donations poured in, partnerships flourished, and awareness campaigns reached audiences far beyond the local area. Through it all, she remained a constant presence, a steady force of kindness and determination driving the mission forward. Looking back, she marveled at how much had changed, not just in the lives of those she helped, but in her own life as well. What had started as a simple act of standing up for a stranger in a diner had blossomed into something extraordinary. She had found her calling, not in grand gestures or heroic feats, but in the quiet, everyday moments of connection that reminded her of what it meant to be human. And yet, despite everything she'd accomplished, she knew the work was far from over. There would always be more people to reach, more barriers to break down, and more hearts to mend. But for the first time in her life, she felt ready to face whatever lay ahead, because she had seen firsthand the power of compassion, and she knew it could move mountains. Months turned into a year, and the nonprofit's work continued to grow in ways no one could have predicted. The waitress, who had once thought of herself as just another face in the crowd, found herself at the heart of a movement that was slowly but surely transforming the community. It wasn't glamorous or easy, far from it, but every step felt meaningful, like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Charlie's progress became a beacon of hope for everyone involved. He thrived in his new apartment, taking pride in making it feel like home. The walls were adorned with photographs he'd salvaged from storage, a smiling wife, a laughing child, and small mementos that reminded him of happier times. He attended therapy sessions regularly, working through years of buried pain and guilt. Slowly, he began to rebuild not only his life, but also his sense of self-worth. One evening, she received an invitation to a small gathering at Charlie's place. When she arrived, she found him standing proudly by the door, a warm smile on his face. Inside, the room was filled with people from the nonprofit, volunteers, counselors, outreach workers, all celebrating how far he'd come. There were plates of homemade food, laughter echoing off the walls, and a palpable sense of gratitude in the air. As the night went on, Charlie stood up to speak. His voice trembled slightly, but his words carried weight. "I don't know where I'd be without all of you," he said, looking around the room. "But most of all, I want to thank her." He pointed to her, and suddenly all eyes were on her. She felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure of what to say. "I didn't do anything special," she protested softly when Charlie finished speaking. But he shook his head firmly. "You showed me that kindness still exists," he replied. "That's more than special, it's everything." Her throat tightened as tears welled up in her eyes. In that moment, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by compassion, she realized something profound. This wasn't just about Charlie anymore. This was about creating ripples, small acts of kindness spreading outward, touching lives in ways no one could foresee. The success stories multiplied. A single mother who had once juggled 3 jobs while caring for her children now ran her own catering business after receiving microloans and mentorship from the nonprofit. An elderly man living out of his car regained stability thanks to affordable housing programs and healthcare support. Even the teenager running away from abuse found safety in a foster home and enrolled in art classes, discovering a passion that gave her hope for the future. Each story reinforced what she had come to believe. Change wasn't about grand gestures, it was about connection. It was about showing up, listening, and believing in someone when they couldn't believe in themselves. And as word spread about the nonprofit's impact, more people joined the cause. Volunteers poured in, eager to contribute their time and skills. Local businesses donated resources, from food and clothing to office supplies and furniture. Even city officials took notice, offering grants and partnerships to expand the organization's reach. Through it all, she remained grounded, never forgetting why she had started this journey in the first place. She still worked part-time at the diner, unable to fully leave behind the place that had shaped so much of her life. But now, her shifts felt different. She saw each customer not just as someone ordering coffee or pancakes, but as a person with their own struggles and triumphs. Sometimes she struck up conversations, learning snippets of their stories. Other times, she simply offered a kind smile or a reassuring word. Every interaction mattered because every person mattered. One day, as she cleared tables during a quiet afternoon lull, a familiar face walked in. It was one of the construction workers who had harassed Charlie months earlier. Her stomach clenched, instinctively memories of that tense moment flooding back. But instead of jeers or insults, he approached her with a sheepish grin. "Hey," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "Can we talk for a sec?" She hesitated before nodding, bracing herself for whatever might come next. To her surprise, he apologized, not just for his behavior that day, but for the way he used to treat others in general. "You made me think," he admitted, "about how quick I am to judge people, you know? So, I've been volunteering with your group, trying to make up for some of the crap I've done." His words caught her off guard, but they also filled her with a quiet sense of pride. Change was possible, even in people who seemed set in their ways. All it took was planting a seed of awareness, however small. As the months passed, the ripple effect of her actions grew clearer. The nonprofit expanded its programs, reaching more individuals and inspiring others to start similar initiatives in neighboring towns. People who had once felt invisible were now stepping into the light, reclaiming their dignity and purpose. And through it all, she stayed true to her roots, reminding everyone, including herself, that humanity thrived on connection, empathy, and action. On a crisp autumn morning, She stood outside the diner watching the sun rise over Main Street. The golden light bathed the town in warmth, casting long shadows across the pavement. For a moment, she allowed herself to reflect on how far she'd come, from serving coffee to changing lives. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But she knew one thing for certain: standing up for someone who couldn't stand up for themselves wasn't just an act of courage, it was an act of love. And love, no matter how small, had the power to ignite a revolution. As she turned to head inside, ready to face another day, she smiled to herself. This wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning. The nonprofit's influence continued to grow, spreading beyond the boundaries of the small town where it had started. What began as a tiny spark, a single act of standing up for someone in need, had ignited a wildfire of compassion and action. The waitress, now fully immersed in her role with the organization, found herself traveling to neighboring communities, sharing stories of hope and resilience at conferences, schools, and community centers. Her message was simple yet powerful. Kindness matters, and even the smallest effort can create waves of change. One of the most remarkable developments came when a local news station featured the nonprofit's work in a segment. The reporter highlighted not just the organization's achievements, but also the personal stories of those whose lives had been transformed. Charlie appeared on camera, speaking candidly about his journey from homelessness to stability. His words resonated deeply with viewers, many of whom reached out afterward to express their admiration or to ask how they could help. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from strangers across the country. Some sent money, others mailed care packages filled with blankets, toiletries, and handwritten notes of encouragement. A group of high school students organized a fundraiser, selling handmade crafts to raise awareness about homelessness. A retired teacher offered free tutoring sessions for individuals trying to complete their education. Even local artists held gallery shows, donating proceeds to support the cause. For the waitress, this newfound attention brought both excitement and humility. She never imagined that her decision to speak up in the diner would lead to something so impactful. Yet she reminded herself daily that none of this was about her. It was about the people being helped. Still, she couldn't deny the sense of fulfillment that came with knowing she'd played a part in creating something bigger than herself. Amidst all the growth and recognition, however, challenges remained. Not everyone embraced the nonprofit's mission. There were skeptics who questioned whether helping those kinds of people was worth the effort. Some accused the organization of enabling laziness or dependency, despite evidence to the contrary. Others dismissed the idea of systemic change altogether, insisting that individuals should pull themselves up without assistance. She encountered these criticisms often, especially during public speaking engagements. At first, they frustrated her. How could anyone look at someone like Charlie or any of the countless others struggling and dismiss their humanity? But over time, she learned to approach such resistance with patience rather than anger. Instead of arguing, she invited critics to visit the nonprofit's facilities, meet the staff and volunteers, and hear directly from those receiving help. More often than not, seeing the reality firsthand softened their stance. One particularly memorable encounter happened during a town hall meeting. A man stood up, visibly irritated, and demanded to know why taxpayer dollars should fund programs for people who refuse to work. The room tensed, waiting for her response. She took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "I understand your concerns," she began, "but let me tell you about someone I met recently. He served our country, risking his life for freedoms we enjoy every day. When he returned home, he faced injuries, physical and emotional, that left him unable to hold down a job. Over time, he lost everything: his family, his home, his sense of purpose. Does that sound like someone who refuses to work? Or does it sound like someone who needs a hand getting back on their feet?" The room fell silent. The man shifted, uncomfortably, before sitting back down, muttering an apology under his breath. It wasn't a victory. It was simply planting another seed of understanding. And sometimes that was enough. As the nonprofit expanded, its focus broadened too. In addition to addressing immediate needs like housing and food, the organization began tackling root causes of poverty and homelessness. They partnered with schools to provide mentorship programs for at-risk youth, collaborated with employers to create job training initiatives, and advocated for policy changes at the local government level. Every step forward required persistence, creativity, and collaboration, but the results spoke for themselves. Perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this evolution was seeing how it inspired others to take action. People who had once felt powerless realized they had the ability to make a difference no matter how small. A young boy started collecting spare change in a jar labeled Helping Hands, eventually donating the entire amount to the nonprofit. A woman began crocheting scarves and hats, distributing them to homeless shelters during the winter months. Even businesses got creative. One coffee shop pledged to donate a portion of its profits to the cause, while another offered discounted meals to low-income families. Through it all, the Waitress remained a steady presence, guiding the organization. With wisdom and humility, she knew better than anyone that real change didn't happen overnight. It was messy, unpredictable, and often exhausting. But it was also beautiful. Each life touched, each obstacle overcome, reinforced her belief in the power of collective action. One evening, as she sat alone in the nonprofit's office after hours, she flipped through a photo album documenting the organization's journey. There were pictures of volunteers handing out meals, families moving into new homes, and children smiling brightly at holiday parties. Among them was a photo of Charlie, standing proudly in front of his apartment building, waving at the camera. She smiled softly, tracing the edges of the image with her finger. In that quiet moment, she reflected on how far she'd come, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. She had started as someone who simply wanted to do the right thing, unsure if her actions would even matter. Now she was part of a movement that had touched hundreds, if not thousands, of lives, and yet she knew this was only the beginning. Outside, the sky darkened, stars beginning to twinkle against the vast expanse. She turned off the lights and locked up, stepping into the cool night air. As she walked home, she thought about the future, not just hers, but the future of the community she loved so dearly. Challenges would continue to arise, and there would always be more work to do. But she carried with her an unshakable belief that kindness, empathy, and determination could overcome even the toughest obstacles. And so, with a heart full of hope and a mind brimming with ideas, she prepared for whatever lay ahead. Because she knew one undeniable truth: when people came together to lift each other up, anything was possible.